Hello, welcome. Today I'm going to be talking about Unity, and we're going to be talking about colliders and tile palettes. To get the tile palette thing to show up, you want to go to the Windows, Package Manager, and make sure you have the 2D Tilemap editor. 2D Sprite and 2D Pixel Perfect would be nice to have, but I'm not going to go over those. I'm only going to go over Tilemap editor and the colliders associated with them. This is not going to be about colliders this episode, but I will briefly go over them. So what a tile palette is it's every single tile you can build up like Legos on top of each other, and you can make objects out of them. You can make some surfaces, you can make backgrounds. So I have a background layer and a collider layer. And to get started, we are going to talk about colliders first. So what is a collider? Well, a collider is something that you can interact with, or it can act as a trigger. You can add colliders by selecting an object, add component, and type in collider. There are different kinds of colliders. If it doesn't have 2D next to it, it's usually going to be a 3D object. 3D colliders can work in 2D games, but 2D colliders are not recommended for 3D games. However, you can have them act as surfaces, but keep in mind that the thinner the collider is, to the point where it's just a single plane, could mean that you can clip through it or glitch through it. So keep that in mind, and always have a backup in case an area is clippable, so that way your character doesn't glitch through the game. In that case, you want to have more of a three-dimensional object instead of a two-dimensional object. Since I'm making a 2D game, I'm going to use 2D colliders. However, my character doesn't use colliders, and I'll go over that later. But what colliders can do is, if you have a rigid body and you have gravity associated, I do not have gravity, by the way, but if you did have gravity associated on your character, they will fall down until they hit a collider that they can stand on. And the collider has to not have a rigid body. They have to be static, basically floating in midair, so that way you can have a surface to land on. If there's no collider below the object and it has a rigid body with gravity, it will fall forever into the void. So what you can do with colliders is you can set is trigger, and what that does is it turns into a trigger, and then you can have inside your script it interact, and if a trigger has been activated in the script, it'll activate a portion of that script. But I'm not going to go over triggers in this episode. I'm going to go over tile palettes and the tile palette collider or tile map collider. So what you want to do is, first thing you want it to have is a area or a place to actually set the tiles. So you want to right click here, 2D object, and create a tile map. This will create a grid with the tile map inside of it. You create stuff in the tile map. The grid is just the position of that tile map. So you don't need to really edit the grid unless you want to move it around or change the dimensions of it. But the tile map is where you're going to actually visually see things. So I have one called BG for background and one called collider for the colliders. Personally, I would keep them separated, the colliders and the backgrounds, because I can then see where the colliders are located and where they are not. And to paint with a collider, or to paint with a tile map, what you want to do is, I'm going to disable that one and show you this grid. It's a brand new grid. It has nothing to do with my current game. And what you want is, if you're going to make this one a background, and then you want to create another tile map. I accidentally made one here. I'm going to put it here and then just delete that grid, but you probably want to right click there and create tile map. And we're going to call this one collision. And so with the collision one, we actually want to add a tile map collider 2D, add a composite, and then we want to get a composite collider 2D. And what this will do is it will combine all the tile maps that are next to each other that have a collider together, so that you don't have multiple colliders. Instead, you have bricks of colliders or columns of colliders, and this is way more efficient. Now, what you want to do to actually add the palettes is you want to have an image with a palette on it. So for this image, I have this thing, and what you can do with that is you can turn into a sprite, change it from single to multiple, and then you want to put the pixels per unit. Some units might be different than others. Make sure you keep everything consistent in your image. So for my case, everything is 8 by 8, so it's an 8 pixels per unit, 8-bit game. You want to click Sprite Editor, and you want to set the each box to have its own segment. So to do that, you want to slice it, and I just use automatic. You can do manual by selecting how big each cell should be or how many there should be in total, and you can change the size by doing that. And then there's the pivot, which you don't really need to worry about. I usually just keep it the way it is, click slice, and then click apply, or if you need to edit something because it's like off by a little bit, you can drag it and fix it so that you can have each one. And then you can name each one as well. I just keep it the number because that's easier to remember. Click apply, and then you're done. I'm going to revert it because I don't want to save it. Once you do that, I would recommend having no compression if it's a pixel art game. That way it doesn't mess up and cause it to be blurry, and then click apply. If it is not a pixel art, you can have compression depending on how big the textures are, but it's all up to you. Once you have that, you'll see that it'll have an arrow next to it. You can click it, and then you'll see all these images, and these are each individual image of each individual tile. And you won't be able to see this because you'll have to add the tile palette window, which is right somewhere here. I believe it's 2D, and then tile palette. Once you pop that in, place it wherever you want it to. I personally place it next to the games tab. You'll have an empty screen, and you'll want to create a new palette. Press create. You can change this if it applies to you. Some people have hexagons or isometric, but most people use rectangle. Press create, create a file, and then select it. So like I create yikes for a previous one. And once you create it, you'll have an empty thing saying drag and place tiles here. So what you want to do is select the first one, scroll down, hold shift, and select the last one. Drag it and place it into here, and then it'll ask you to place it into a file. Once you, so I'd recommend selecting the same file that you created previously, and then it will show up like this. And once you have this showed up, you can now select each one of these tiles, and if you have the select tool, you can just select tiles like that, but it's not really useful. If you have the drag tool, you can move each tiles. If you have the paint tool, you can actually paint with each tile. You have to select the tile, obviously. If you want to create a rectangle box, you can do that. If you want to select one that you've previously done, you can use the drop thingy, the water drop. If you want to erase, you select the erase one. And then if you want to fill, you can select one, and then you can fill whatever. So that's that one. You can extend it as well with the fill tool, which is really nice. And we're gonna go back to select tool so he doesn't get that thing. And I've accidentally made this on the collision. I wanted to make it on the background. You can do that by changing it. If an object is not available, let's select this one. It'll only show one. So you want to have both active. So what I'm going to do is I could erase it, but I'm just going to delete it because we don't need it anymore. That was just to show the background. So what I'm going to do is, that should have been the background. I should have said. To erase it takes a while. I wonder if I can just delete them. No, I can't. So yeah, make sure you don't make mistakes because you'll have to erase it manually. And as you can see, they're all colliders now. Now, if you have the reason why they're all automatically colliders, you can tell by the green borders around them, is because it has the Tilemap collider and the composite collider, so it automatically makes it collider. Whereas the background, it didn't have these two, so if I were to have drawn on the background, it wouldn't actually affect the game. You wouldn't actually be able to touch those boxes. Now, what you can do if you want, I'm going to delete this grid. I'm going to enable this grid. And what I have is, you'll notice that there's a lot less here than there are here. There's actually the right amount. It's just that a lot of these are copy and paste, and I just reuse them, and then I just have them flip over here as well, or flip upside down. Some of these even match itself, so sometimes I can recycle, and that just saves space, but you probably don't need to do that. You can have your own tile palette separate, and you can have them more complex, instead of them being tiny lines that I have to figure out and puzzle piece together, whereas you can just have the puzzle pieces already set up. But that's just my personal way. And if you do want to do flips, you want to click the select tool, select it, and then you can rotate them. So if I wanted this side to mirror the other side, I'll do 180 degrees. But obviously it's not going to flip the whole thing. You actually have to actually flip the physical grid to actually cause it to flip. It just flips each individual image. So this one, as you can see, the black part, the big black part's on the left side. If I were to flip it 180 degrees, it would go on this side instead. This one turns it around. And this one I don't think does much. Yeah. And then goes back up. So that's if you want to rotate it. You can scale it too if you really wanted to, but there's no real reason for me to, because this is a pixel perfect game. So I'm gonna go back to 1, and then you can also change the position slightly if you want, but then again I'm not going to do that. So that's the tile palette and the colliders. Now you'll notice that my player, when it hits the colliders, it stops. That's because I set it that way. In most physics games you'll have that, but for my game I actually don't have a collider active on my player, as you can see here. I don't know why I have two, but for my game, the collision detection, there's no actual physics. You can have it so that your player has a collider, and when it touches it, it'll automatically stop, because that's how the physics worked. But because of the physics of my game, I have to use a raycast method. So when the character raycasts one unit in front of it, you'll see that there's an object. I'll go over raycasting in the next episode, but basically this way it keeps my character from basically being untouchable, but it still has a raycast, as you can see. The raycast is exactly 1 unit, as you can tell by this blue line. So if it touches the collider, which is right here, or is inside the collider, it will no longer move in that direction. And if I go down, it's no longer touching, so it can move down. And same thing with when it goes left. The player can't go left. And you might be wondering, why does it go inside in this one and not inside in this one? It's because I set the height slightly differently, so I allow it to go inside, but it's still not technically allowed, whereas it's not allowed to go inside when it's left and right, because I want the player height to not be interactive with the actual unit. I want these bottom boxes to not actually go inside, but the top two can. So that's it for raycasting in my collider tutorial and palette tutorial. The raycasting, I'll go into more detail on how it works, but that's how I have my character collide with it. You don't have to do it that way. You just use the regular physics, but since my player does a round to the nearest number system, where the player always rounds its position to the nearest number by moving in fractions of 8, so it goes 1 pixel per unit, or it goes 1 pixel per millisecond. That way it can travel a full 1 unit, and then it can round itself to the nearest unit after that, so that doesn't actually get pushed away by accident. And there we go.